It's Sunday, August 21, 2022. Welcome to the 27th episode in this series from MeidasTouch and 5-Minute News, called The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. Subscribe to this show as audio in addition to my daily 5-Minute News podcast on iTunes or wherever you get yours. Joining me today is Ryan Busse, a reformed firearms executive who formerly helped build one of the world's most iconic gun companies, but quit and authored the book Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America. He now serves as a senior policy advisor to the gun safety advocacy group Giffords. Ryan, thank you for joining us on The Weekend Show.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me here today.
So this it's always an interesting conversation for me to talk about firearms because I'm from the UK where we don't have any. And in fact, our police don't have any. You know, we have firearms units that show up if they're needed. We don't have school shootings. We don't have hardly any gun crime. We do have a knife problem, I'll give you that. But, so culturally, this is always an education for me. And so you're a kind of, expert witness in this case. Just tell us a little bit about why you flipped.
Well, I don't, I'm not so sure that I flipped. I think that the changing culture of our nation changed around me more so than I changed. And I know this is a common refrain with people such as myself, but I grew up on a rural farm and ranch where guns were a very integral part and an important part of our culture and our life. And so was responsibility. I got into the firearms industry much like a kid who plays baseball and perhaps soccer in your case and, makes the major leagues or finds himself in Wembley. But, for me, it was a dream come true in large part. And for the first part of my career, those sorts of dreams and the sort of responsibility I grew up with were integral in the industry, but that changed radically, really starting in the early to mid 2000s and then to where we are now.
And so what was it that made the change for you? Did something happen politically or was there a shooting event? What was the story?
Well, I look back at it now, and realize it was more a series of things that happened. At the time, I thought it was a singular event. I stood up for wild places and conservation in, some of our last iconic American wild places like the Roan Plateau in Colorado, the Val Vidal in New Mexico, and then my sacred place, the Badger 2 Medicine in Montana, that were set to be drilled and industrialized by the Bush-Cheney energy plan in 2004. When I did that, the industry that claimed to be for hunters and tradition and all the things that I had grown up with really viciously attacked me because I dared criticize the wrong party, even though I was an up-and-coming award-winning executive. And I realized then that the bill of goods that I had been sold and all Americans had been sold about this tradition and culture and all the things that the industry said it was for was really just a lie. And it was becoming a partisan, moneyed political machine that was all about power and money, not about the products that it was selling. And so at the time, that 2004 speech at the National Press Club where I stood up and criticized, that for me, that was a precipitating event. I look back now and realize it was a longer form sort of process than that, but that's what I thought at the time.
This subject is polarizing only really for a certain group, isn't it? I mean, most sound, civilized people know that there is a major gun problem in the US, and the likes of Wayne LaPierre, who still runs the NRA and has done since 1991, have a very different view of America and a very different view of gun ownership. Can you just explain really what those two sides look like?
Well, yeah. First off, I agree with your statement about it being polarized for a small subset of Americans. On the other hand, I contend in my book, and I believe that this sort of all or nothing kind of hell no extremism that was fostered and developed and grown and then handed off by the NRA to our country is not just relevant to a small subset of Americans, because that hell no extremist radicalized culture now infects every single thing about United States politics and policy, climate policy, women's reproductive rights, even local school boards, right? They're all now infected by this all or nothing radicalization. But to your point, it has roots in a subset of American politics, meaning the gun culture subset of politics. And unlike England or other countries, we have a specific constitutional amendment specifically dealing with the gun issue. That and the culture that I described to you growing up, hunting and shooting with my father, these sorts of cultural connections that so many Americans feel. When you throw that and authoritarian politics and 20 years of war and everything that is American politics into this soup, it's now radicalized everything. And I think it's important to note that nothing changes the political equation. Nothing, either in the macro or the micro sense, like the presence of guns. If you think about it in your own personal setting, if you're at a dinner table with a few of your friends and you're having a conversation waiting on another friend to show up, you can have spirited conversation, maybe wine, who knows, political debates. But if that last person shows up and that person has a loaded AR-15 on their chest, right, everything changes instantly.
The party's over.
The power equation is completely upended. Their opinion is the only one that matters. And in a macro sense, that's what armed authoritarians are doing to our democracy, right? When they show up with arms or the threat of arms, the equation changes immediately. And so both in a sense of your daily life with just individual people, and then in our larger civil societal sense, guns really have a unique role in that they can sort of upend the power equation instantly, unlike anything else that you can think of.
And we've seen evidence of that recently. January 6th, Carl Rittenhouse, these types of events where it's like, grab the weapon. And I'm very interested in this kind of machismo aspect to this, which goes back to childhood. And this is what we don't have in the UK, obviously. We go with our dads to fish, right? But we don't go to shoot. What is it about, and I would just also say that all the shootings that I am aware of, certainly school shootings, are committed by men, not by women. And women tend not to play a part in this crime in any great way. So just talk to me a little bit about that relationship between a child and their father growing up in America, and how a child is indoctrinated into thinking that a gun is anything other than a dangerous weapon.
Well, so I try in my book and in my speeches, which I gave one yesterday, I try to put some color on this, right? If you're a young American boy who receives a rifle or shoots with his father, as I did, when that gun enters your hand, there is this sort of American swagger that sort of courses through you, right? All of a sudden, you're the master of your own destiny. When I had my little rifle as a kid growing up, which I did, I could be a lawman or a hunter. I could provide food. But the point was that the power equation changed quickly. And I think
you could be the sheriff.
I could be the sheriff, right? And certainly in my own mind, which really, when you have the gun in your hand, is really all that matters. And I think that is uniquely American. And for those of you who observe now or here, but observe from the outside looking in, there is this, in some ways it can be alluring, this American sort of John Wayne swagger taken too far. And it can easily jump over the line where it's taken too far, where responsibility is dismissed. These sorts of rights, I contend, it's a massive, massive right to be able to own and obtain firearms. It requires a massive responsibility that goes along with it. Right now, that balance for Americans is way out of whack because, as you note, now American males, largely young American males, are trying to fix their machismo problems, their man problems, their whatever, by running out and becoming an instant tactical badass, which is what we allow them to be because we give them the weapons of war. They can purchase them on their 18th birthday and as many 30-round magazines as they want, which the Uvalde shooter actually did exactly that. It started, and a part of this is because the industry actively, aggressively markets to this segment. They create this customer. In 2010 and 12, the famous now man card campaign from Bushmaster, which was owned by Remington, an AR-15 company, literally said, you get your man card. This thing gives you the rights to not be questioned if you buy this gun. And if you don't have this gun, you're not a man. You don't have the man card. It was a literal physical card that you got in the mail. That man card rifle was used by a 19-year-old kid in a school called Sandy Hook. So you can see how this
So the marketing of firearms, it's a bit like the meat industry, isn't it? You eat a steak and it makes you strong. You're a man. And, there's been a whole thing with the meat lobby. And I suppose the kind of wokeness that is being fought against, wokeness is probably pushing back against machismo men with their guns, isn't it?
Yes. And so now we have this whole societal battle. And it's this, I like to say now, it's a storm creating its own weather. For every bit of wokeness that pushes back against this, you have an ever stiffening backbone of the machismo crowd, the marketing crowd, the Kyle Rittenhouse saying hell no to Antifa crowd, the I'll go down and be a man's man and shoot people at a Black Lives Matter protest or an Antifa protest, right? It just keeps, it's like a cyclone. We're just pumping heat and moisture into it, and it just keeps spinning and spinning and growing and growing. And if we don't stop it, it's, I fear that we think we've had ugly days. I don't think our days, I don't think those are over.
Let's just talk about the Bill of Rights and why it is that gun owners and, far-right Republicans, they talk about their right to own a weapon. But in the Constitution, it doesn't talk about a semi-automatic weapon, does it? It's probably referencing a musket that can shoot a single shot. So how do you qualify that argument that says, when people say, well, it's my constitutional right?
Well, we do have a constitutional right to own guns. The Constitution does not provide, for any sort of unfettered right. It has to be balanced with responsibility and with regulations. And I think that any reasonable person in America understands that. We're currently and have been in a debate about what constitutional rights are, where they stop, where they start, how broad they are, how narrow they are. I guess that's been going on since we had our Bill of Rights, but it seems to have been ratcheted up here, to the extreme form recently. And I think we're wrestling with the implications of that as a nation.
Different states have different laws on firearms, and the open carry law enables people to show off that kind of machismo, gun-toting attitude. Do you think that there's going to come a time? I mean, I'm starting to feel it, but I'm interested in your view. We've recently, off the back of the search of Mar-a-Lago, heard a lot of Trump supporters saying that, the next time we fight, it won't be with flags. That there will be a kind of civil war between states that enable people to, proudly carry their guns. We've seen kind of militia standing outside FBI buildings and protesting with their semi-automatic weapons. What's the likelihood that politics is going to drive kind of warfare on the ground? I don't want to dramatize this, but I recognize that we're already starting to see this in some places.
I don't think your dramatization is in any way hyperbolic, to be honest with you. I think that the country now is teetering on a precipice. Look, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these customers who have purchased AR-15s, largely AR-15s, other guns too, but much of it, let's face it, much of it is centered around the guns of war, the AR-15. They have purchased this gun, or many of them, and perhaps truckloads of 30-round magazines and all the ammunition that they have, with the very thought, if not dream, of someday using those weapons to overthrow a tyrannical government. Go ask them. They'll say it. They're very forthright about it, right? I own this. I must own this as my patriotic duty because I may have to overthrow a government that I disagree with.
Because it says that in the Constitution. So that's how they've translated those kind of, they've rewritten.
No, that's not actually in the Constitution, but there were founding father documents who, the Thomas Jefferson, the blood witnessing or referencing that every once in a while you need a good revolution.
Okay,
right? Yeah. So many of these people have taken that to mean that they should do their patriotic duty. They should stand by. They should almost wish, if not hope, for a bloody civil war. And the firearms industry has tapped into that, especially for the last 15 years. And when many of these guns are sold, they're sold with that specific purpose in mind. And sometimes they come with little snippets of the Constitution in the packaging. In other words, we're telling these people to be good, patriotic Americans, they must be ready to do this. And so when something happens with Donald Trump or something happens that they perceive to be a precipitating event, January 6th, for instance, I don't think that we should find it surprising that a certain subset of them want to rush out and play hero. I wasn't surprised when Kyle Rittenhouse walked down on the streets of Kenosha to kill people. We're marketing this to these people, and marketing works.
Let's just talk about the number of guns in circulation. I read, I can't remember, but you can correct me, that there were literally millions of these semi-automatic weapons that had already been sold. Is that right? I mean, how many of these types of weapons of war are currently owned by civilians?
So first off, I'll give you some data points here. Anybody who's been to the United States or driven through any of our cities knows how chock full our streets and highways can be. Just drive outside of LA any given time and you would swear the number of cars, like there's fewer stars in the sky, right, than there are number of cars in the United States. Well, there's about 280 million registered vehicles in the United States, 280 million. There are approximately 410 million firearms in the United States. Of those, there are somewhere, and I'll get to why this is debatable, but there's somewhere between 20 and 40 million AR-15s, AK-47s, assault weapon type guns. 20 and 40 million. That's about one for every 8 or 9 people in the United States. The 400 and some million is about 1.2 guns for every single person in the United States. That's a lot of guns, right? It's important to note that up until 2005 or 6, there were virtually no assault weapons or AR-15s in the United States. There were some. I mean, perhaps 30, 40, 50, maybe on a big year, 60,000 of those things were sold in the United States each year. Today, in 2020, there were about 4.5 million AR-15s and AR-15 variants sold in a single year. That's 12,000 per day. 12,000 per day.
So even if you were to do an all-out semi-automatic weapons ban, that would be a ban from buying them, wouldn't it? I mean, it wouldn't change school shootings. It wouldn't limit the number of massacres that happen because the guns are already in possession of the people that might one day use them.
Yeah, you have 40, let's say we have 40 million of them out there, which I don't think. And by the way, the reason that this is debatable, the reason I say between 25 and 40 million, the United States does not measure this. There are no official statistics. I mean, we know, we know more about how many Nike tennis shoes are sold every day than we do about how many AR-15s are sold every day, right? It's craziness. So it's somewhat debatable, but it's a lot. It's in the tens of millions. There's no debating that. And to your point about a ban, yes. That's why this talk of ban is so complex and in my mind sort of misses the mark. The mark is that we have this overt cultural problem. We have a culture that glorifies this, that wishes for war, that tells these troubled young men that they can solve their problems in an instant by grabbing a weapon of war. And I don't know how a ban fixes any of that.
There was a ban of sorts, wasn't there? Was it under Clinton and then it was put back by Bush? Am I right there?
Yeah. So we had what we called, it's referred to as the assault weapons ban. It went into effect on September 13th, 1994, was signed by Bill Clinton in the Rose Garden on that day. James Brady, who was President Reagan's press secretary, was beside him. And by the way, President Reagan, the iconic conservative hero of the entire GOP nation, right, wrote a letter to the Congress, to every single member of Congress, where he begged for that assault weapons ban to be passed. And it was, barely, but it was. And it was signed into law September 13th, 1994. On September 13th, 2004, George W. Bush opted not to renew that ban. What is notable about that, though, is that assault weapons technically were banned, but the definition of assault weapon is a slippery thing. AR-15s themselves were not banned with that law. You could buy millions of them. The industry could have sold millions of them and built millions of them. They didn't. An assault weapon was defined, as example, as like an AR-15, but with additional features that made it an assault weapon. So if you add a flash suppressor to it, or you add a folding stock to it, right? You added these features onto the base gun and then it became deemed an assault weapon. But the standard AR-15 that you and I know none of us could tell the difference between a pre-ban and a post-ban gun from 50 feet away. You couldn't tell the difference. Those guns were perfectly legal during those 10 years. Why didn't they sell? Because the industry and the nation knew that proliferating those in a complex democracy like ours would lead to what we have today. So there used to be a voluntary prohibition. And I think the important thing about that law was that it set a social stigma that reinforced that norm so that the industry did not rush out and sell those, even though they could have perfectly legally.
But mass shootings did go down during that period.
Mass shootings did go down. And of course, I'm not here saying that the assault weapons ban didn't facilitate that decrease. But the truth is that in a complex society such as ours, there are multiple effects. There are multiple causes for every large societal shift. So mass shootings did not stop during that time. They did decrease, and who knows, there could have been other factors involved. We know now, though, that almost every mass shooting that happens, I could start Sandy Hook, Uvalde, Sutherland Springs, Las Vegas, Buffalo, Highland Park that just happened. Almost every single one is happening with an AR-15 now.
I want to have a brief but explicit conversation with you about the effect of these guns on humans, because I don't think people quite realize what a semi-automatic weapon does to a human body, especially a child. It's very different to shooting a pistol, right? The effect is such that sometimes people can't be identified because of the extent of the injuries that are caused by these weapons.
Well, what should be noted first is that the AR-15, so let's just back up and give a broad view of this so I can answer your specific question. The AR-15 it's true, and gun proponents say this, that it's just like other semi-automatic guns. And in some ways, that is correct. It has a trigger. You pull the trigger, it goes bang every time you pull the trigger. It has a barrel, it has a stock. So in a lot of ways, if you equate it to automobiles, it has four wheels, it has a steering wheel, it has an engine, it has a transmission, just like the commonalities of all guns. But if you think about an AR-15, it is as though it is like a Formula One race car. It is very specifically designed to do something very fast. It corners very well. It gets between two locations exceedingly quick. It accelerates super fast, just like a Formula One race car, right? And we don't put Formula One race cars on the street because we don't need 19-year-old kids doing 160 miles an hour in straightaways and then turning into school zones, right? Same sort of thing. An AR-15 is built to take lives in an aggressive way by soldiers on a battlefield as fast as possible. Now, it uses a 223 round cartridge, right? And that's a 22 caliber bullet, a small bullet, and it flies very fast, 3,200 feet a second. About 55 grains, about 3,200 feet a second. The average handgun bullet's much heavier than that, and it goes slow. It goes the average handgun bullet somewhere in the 1,000 feet per second range. So the AR-15 is about 3 times faster. It's not a very large cartridge. It's not a very powerful cartridge. When people say it's very powerful, it's not really true. Almost all hunting rifles are way more powerful than an AR-15. But it's a fast little cartridge that at short ranges, 50 to about 250 yards, shoots this fast bullet that comes apart when it hits things, and it's meant to rip flesh apart. And that's why varmint rifles use the same cartridge. So people who want to kill vermin in their yards or in their fields, and I know some people in the UK do this, they use this same cartridge because the bullet comes apart and it rips things apart when it hits it. It's small and it goes very fast. But don't think about it as high power because like a 30-06 hunting rifle, far, far, far more powerful. But the thing about a 30-06 versus this gun is low recoil, right? It's not a lot of powder. It's not meant to shoot a deer at 500 yards away. It's meant to shoot things very quickly. Think of that Formula One again, very quickly at ranges between 50 and 250 yards away. That's why soldiers march into battle with it. It stays on target. It shoots very quickly. They can put lots of shots and very accurately, very quickly follow-up shots, same things we see in mass shootings.
And this is why 32 children were killed at Stockton, and this is why 31 were killed in the University of Texas and 25 killed in Springfield at Thurston, because the number of people that can be killed very, very quickly is all because of this gun. And if this gun didn't exist and school shootings were done with other weapons, you wouldn't see death on such a large scale. Is that right?
Well, look, you could have a mass shooting with a bolt-action hunting rifle, of which I own many, and lots of hunters across America own many. The last mass shooting we saw with a bolt-action rifle was actually University of Texas. I don't know if this is the one you're referencing, but that was 1960-something, 70-something. Like, that guy got up on a flagpole with a bolt-action rifle. Nobody knew what to do. That was the last one. Since then, everyone with a rifle has been with an AR-15 semi-automatic style rifle. Why? For the same reason the military picks it. It's specifically designed to do this very quickly. Some kid could march into a school with a bolt-action rifle. And sadly, that kid would probably kill multiple people. It would be a low number of people because the rifle functions so much slower and has such less efficient recoil management. He would have a hard time shooting it quickly.
But, here's another analogy. British films are all about, like, poor people kind of, having deep conversations with each other. This is a very, very, simple example. American films, successful American films are, the Marvel movies, Iron Man, guns and shooting and explosions, right? That's kind of the two kind of creative palettes of the movie industry. Is it any wonder that there is a desire by people who have a grievance or who choose, and I believe it is a choice, to go and shoot up in a school, to kind of go for the type of weapon they've seen in films? I don't believe that, video game. There used to be this argument that video games made it worse. I don't agree with any of that. But I do recognize that films and popular culture in the US still celebrates weapons and killing and death and destruction and, a whole lot of explosions. And Hollywood makes a lot of money out of that. True.
There's no doubt about it. And one of the best ways to sell guns, as the firearms industry knows, is to get them placed in movies or video games. I saw it all the time, and it's celebrated, and it does sell a lot of guns. And so are the causes, I think to your point, are the causes in America probably more diffuse than just picking on a singular thing? Well, of course they are. It's a complex society with 370 million people and lots of different inputs. Of course they are. But I don't think we can or shy away from the fact that there are Japan has a huge gaming culture, and for the most part, watches most of the same movies we do, right? They don't have Parkland. They don't have Sutherland Springs. They don't have Las Vegas. They don't have Uvalde. They don't have Highland Park, right? What's the difference? This glorification and easy access to guns.
And in fact, Shinzo Abe was executed the other day with a homemade gun.
Yeah,
that's what was necessary in Japan, because you can't buy a gun there.
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for a culture in which I can't go purchase a hunting rifle or a shotgun or a self-defense pistol for my family or to hunt with my boys. I'm not. What I am saying is, if we don't get this responsibility thing balanced, none of these rights are going to matter, right? An authoritarian culture that upends democracy is not going to care about the Second Amendment. That's why the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Boogaloo Boys, all these people that think they're going to stumble into some sort of authoritarian utopia where everybody owns guns and gets along, that's silly talk. It's absolute silly talk.
Let's talk about the politics of this, because Republicans will have you think that Democrats want to take away all of your guns. That's the rhetoric that is used. They're coming for your guns. They're coming for your rights. This is the rhetoric, and it's untrue. There is obviously a push for gun control on the left, certainly a semi-automatic weapons ban. Let's just talk about the kind of modern politics of this now. Do you feel like the Democrats are doing enough? Are they using the right language? Do they understand how to really kind of fight against this Republican rhetoric that they're coming for your weapons?
I think there are lots of well-meaning folks, many of whom I've met who are lawmakers, who literally are really trying to do the right thing. Do I think that the rhetoric and the approach is always effective as it should be? No, I don't. And the truth is that we allow the far right to set the narrative, to set the rules of the game by saying anything, including universal background checks, is quote unquote infringement on our rights, right? This word that's in the Second Amendment, shall not be infringed. I don't believe, in fact, I believe that kind of talk is just complete bunk. There's nothing that says, nothing in the Second Amendment that says, and we should make sure everybody is armed and crazy and does nothing responsible, right? But that's what they would have us believe. So I think the way the Democrats should approach this is to say, look, we understand the right to own guns. We also understand the rights of kids in Uvalde. We also understand the rights of those parade goers in Highland Park. And if we're going to maintain our rights, including our Second Amendment rights, they must be balanced with responsibility. And that either happens voluntarily or it happens through regulation. I argue that the gun industry used to do this largely voluntarily, right? We talked about during the assault weapons ban where the industry didn't proliferate AR-15s largely through a sense of responsibility. That has been erased. So if the industry and gun owners will not be responsible, sadly, we must have laws that do the regulating and enforce responsibility for everyone else. Because that little kid in Uvalde, those parade goers in Highland Park, they have rights too. And that's the way a complex society works. The magic happens in the gray area. And the far right wants the argument to happen on the fringes. It's either this or this. It's black or white. It's 1 or 10. It's up or down. But that's not true. We're talking about this small slice of regulation in the middle of everything. And I think if the Democrats focused a little bit more on that sort of language, because people live with infringements every day. The people who say they won't accept infringements accept them every day. Why? Well, I don't know. I walked outside and I noticed that not every 8-year-old has a howitzer. Like there aren't A-10 warthogs parked in my neighbor's parking lot. The guy down the street doesn't have a thermonuclear warhead, right? So we have infringements already. It's not about whether or not we have infringements. It's about what they are and how reasonable they are.
There's a story this week out of North Carolina where gun reform advocates have decried absolute insanity, a move by the sheriff there to arm his school resource officers with assault rifles on campus in addition to their service-issue handguns. This is Madison County Sheriff Buddy Harwood said he felt obliged to act in hope of preventing another massacre such as the one at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, that killed 19 students and 2 teachers. How does this sit with you, the idea, because we've heard this a lot, from Republicans, certainly, and governors in these states where these shootings have happened, that arming teachers, we heard this from Trump, even when Trump was president, arm the teachers, turn the school into a fortress, that this is actually a much better way of protecting from future school shootings than trying to remove guns from society.
So there's a move in Ohio, similar to the North Carolina story you're talking about, that actually pushes to arm teachers, not just school resource officers. And of course, we have the North Carolina situation that you reference. Without getting terribly colorful here, I do want to say it's absolute effing insanity. It's insanity. We pile so much on our teachers to begin with in our educational system. It's sort of at the end of all of our American cultural woes. We have income distribution. We have, a bajillion societal problems, and we seem to force fixing all of those onto our educational system and our teachers. Do we really think that throwing guns into that situation? We had 100 armed professionals in Uvalde, and they were all paralyzed by one kid with an AR-15. We had a security guard at the Tops grocery store in Buffalo. I don't know how many good guys with guns we need, but apparently we don't have enough. So when the next shooting happens and we arm one of these guys, so we need 2, we need 10. Literally, like when you say make a fortress, that's what we're going to end up doing, making a fortress. It just seems so much more logical to me to just stop the troubled kids that are coming in there with guns in the first place. And so foolish, insane, dangerous, all of those things, I think they all apply.
I have children in public school here in the US, and I talk to my daughter. She's only 6, but she explained to me that they do a thing called stranger drills. They're not called shooter drills. They're called stranger drills. And she explained to me how they all have to, get under the table and the door gets locked. And this is my 6-year-old daughter explaining this to me. She doesn't understand about the bigger picture. I've never talked about school shootings to her. I don't think that's appropriate yet. But I recognize that this is a reality of bringing kids up in the United States. I have so many kind of emotional feelings about this subject. And when you have kids, obviously it changes everything. What is the mindset of gun rights activists and Republican lawmakers and governors who cannot get emotional about the death of children in schools? That to them, gun ownership is more important. What do you think about these people who have positions of responsibility, lawmakers, who just cannot get connected emotionally to this subject?
So, as with some of my other answers, I'll give you a bit of a roundabout answer, but I think it will illuminate why this is so crazy. All of us value the freedom to drive our vehicles from one place to another, right? And that encompasses, that freedom to drive and be mobile really does encompass a lot of our other rights, the right to pursue livelihood, to happiness, to go to a job, to go to a grocery store, to feed one's family, right? So that it's not just driving a car. It's a big set of rights that are encompassed in that. We don't value it so much that we think it's okay to drive 90 miles an hour through a school zone and mow down kids. And if we did, and somebody said, hey, you killed 8 kids by driving through there. And this is the equivalent of someone saying, well, that's just, that's the price we pay for having automobiles and being able to drive across town. Sometimes you're just going to somebody's just going to mow down some kids. Well, you could say, well, why don't you put a school speed zone limit in there? And the equivalent of the Republicans would be saying, nope, got to be able to drive 90 miles an hour, right, wherever you want to go. If this sounds incredibly just detached and insane, it is. It is detached and insane. The way that those people rationalize these things is to say, well, yeah, some kids die and people do bad things, and that's the price of freedom. That's what we're going to end up doing because, we need to give 18-year-old kids in Uvalde, Texas, the ability to buy AR-15s literally the day they turn 18 years old, and buy as many 30-round magazines as they want. The kid in Uvalde had 60 30-round magazines. 60. We don't have to do that. That is in no way, shape, or form any more sane than allowing somebody to drive 90 miles an hour through a school zone. Same thing. We know not to rationalize one, and we rationalize the other. I don't get it.
And these Republicans, these governors, these lawmakers, they have children. They have families. They have kids in school themselves. At Uvalde, famously now widely reported, we had parents of children screaming at law enforcement. Get in there, do something. Parents running in themselves to try and do something because they felt completely ignored by the very police who, with their machismo guns, as you say, they were completely stunned by this situation. Their training had only happened a few weeks earlier, and yet they still didn't have the cognitive skills to go in. So they can make an argument for owning these guns. They can make an argument for allowing these guns to be sold. But when it came to that actual moment where we needed good guys with guns, they let us down.
Well, the truth is that when the shooting starts, when the bullets start flying, decisions get really hard to make, right? We know this in war. We've seen it, lots of people in war freak out. They can't shoot back. I've even seen it in hunting situations where somebody thinks they fired a gun 5 or 6 times and all they did is cycle the bolt 5 or 6 times. They literally cognitively do not understand in a high stress situation what just happened. And so back to our school resource officer or a teacher, or we have trained professionals who show up in Uvalde and they can't get it right. And I'm really not, as easy as it is to pick on all of those trained professionals. And I think there's lots of mistakes made, probably more than you or I can count in, 5 of these episodes. But the fact is that when bullets start flying and you get in a stressful situation, it's hard for any human to perform perfectly. And we're asking teachers to perform perfectly. We're asking resource officers to perform perfectly. Like, it's just not going to happen.
Let's talk about the argument that that gun advocates use about people that commit school shootings. They blame it on their mental health, and they use the kind of psychiatry of this to claim, oh, well, you know, he was crazy, and that's why he did it, and not everyone is crazy. I mean, this is a very naive conversation, isn't it, when they get into this? Because, you know, we all suffer from mental health issues to a greater or lesser degree. But we also know the difference between, you know, keeping ourselves in check and go buying a gun and killing 30 people.
Well, if we really do have all of these mental health problems that you properly note that the other side often denotes, and I think look, the truth is, just like any society, there are lots of mental health challenges. We all have them, and to some degree. We all have them. But if it is really this bad that we have this much mental health, these many mental health issues, are we then also saying that we should make it easier for these sorts of people to go buy guns when they're literally mentally ill? Because that's what we're doing. Most of the Republican approach at this point is to reduce the regulation on purchasing guns, not to increase it, to reduce it. When red flag laws are discussed, it's the Republicans say, no. We need to reduce that. That could be a problem, right? So, if mental health is this big an issue, then that just makes the gun issue that much more of an issue.
And the red flag laws didn't help in Uvalde, did they?
Well, there are red flag laws. The red flag laws have to be properly funded. They have to be aggressively enforced. They have to be researched. There has to be a system that records these incidents and then follows up on them. And so, as with many things on the GOP side of the ledger, it's easy to say, well, mental health, it's a lot harder to do all of the things, to fund everything in the system to make that work better, to make those things be enforced. And that's what we have to do. Not only do we just need a red flag law, we need a system to track it, enforce it, remove it, all of those things.
Can we just talk very quickly about the Supreme Court rule that happened a month or two ago, saying that Americans have the broad right to arm themselves in public? They struck down this New York law that placed strict limits on carrying guns outside the home and set off a scramble in other states that have similar restrictions. They reckon that this now could spark a wave of lawsuits seeking to loosen existing state and federal restrictions. It'll force 5 states, California, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, home to a quarter of all Americans, to rewrite their gun laws. The Supreme Court, as we know, is stacked in a very fascist direction right now, isn't it? And you know, tragically, it was really, I guess, Trump's lasting legacy was putting people in who are going to, fight against rational, civilized debate at every juncture. This is very much part of that, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this whole originalist idea, which is now being pushed by many of the Trump-appointed judges, and of course some others who were on the court before then. Clarence Thomas has now glommed onto this idea.
Or his wife has, and he's...
Well, certainly, yeah. But this idea that we're going to somehow divine the originalist idea of the way the Constitution was written, in which case, like, muskets were all that existed, right? So, yes, it's a twisted thing. I do... But the nuts and bolts of where we are, and I could bemoan all this forever, but the case is decided and it's going to have legal implications, whether I sit here and bitch about it for 20 minutes or not. It is going to happen. And so it's going to complicate these local and state regulations for sure. I don't think, and interestingly enough, one of the most sort of articulate arguments for sensible gun regulation is actually in the Heller decision that was authored by Antonin Scalia, the most famous gun case prior to this Bruen case. And it essentially says, well, yes, and I'm going to paraphrase Scalia here, but yes, you have the right to defend yourself in your home with a gun. But people should note that this decision does not mean that reasonable regulations cannot be put on guns to protect the general public. It goes on for paragraphs, but it essentially says that. And so I think now we're going to see a reshuffling in local and state areas about what those reasonable regulations mean. They'll probably focus more on marketing and distribution and less on the actual possession and sale of a gun, because I think that I do think the Bruen case is going to complicate those enforcements.
Can we end on a slightly more optimistic note? And this is from a story that comes out of Florida, unusually. This was a statewide survey that was done last month that showed that large majorities in both parties told researchers that they support universal background checks and a mandatory waiting period for anyone trying to purchase a weapon. This really supports my view that we are underrepresented, that actually our governors and our Congress people and our senators have views that are not in line with the people, their constituents, the people they represent. So is this more a case that actually, if you were to survey Americans, I know this was just Florida, but if you were to survey Americans, that actually people are civilized and people are logical and they recognize that background checks are the least that should be done across the board. And really it's politics that is pushing this position, this opinion that is not followed through in the wider society?
I think there's little doubt that what you say is correct. And the way I explain it, I guess, is like background checks pull at 82%. Red flag laws pull at 80%. I could go on down the line and I could get several policies down and they're still pulling in the 60%. As you know, hardly anything pulls at 82%. Hell, ice cream doesn't pull at 82%. And yet here we are, and yet we cannot pass it. And why is that? And your political assertion is exactly correct. Because guns and gun politics and the extremist hell no way that gun politics have infiltrated all of our other politics means that, we look at this as a little pebble on the road, an 82% pebble that we ought to be able to pick up and just toss over the fence. But when we reach down and pick it up, it's attached to a larger boulder, and that boulder is attached to a larger mountain. And the boulder and the mountain are the GOP and the DNA of the entire right. By attacking and by going after something as simple as background checks, we're not actually just going after that. We're going after the very way in which the GOP has constructed itself and its politics. And that's why it's so much harder. We're not just trying to pass a policy. By doing that, we would be undoing the very way the political right has constructed itself. And that's why it's so much more difficult. That's why there's so much more ardent. That and the fact that right now, a very few number of senators, I don't remember how many it is. It's 13, something like that. They represent a very small percentage of the population, right? So, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana have about, a third the population of Los Angeles. There are 6 or 8 senators in those states that I just noted. And yet, if, maybe, Los Angeles has, in the grand scheme of things, access to about, 3/4 of a senator because of the way, there's 2 senators from California. In other words, we have a system set up now that is in a large way, not very democratic. And guns, I don't think this rears its ugly head anywhere as bad as gun politics.
The makeup of the Senate and of Congress, a lot of this was designed to keep white people in power, wasn't it? It was, the Electoral College, all of this. What's really behind this are quite dark forces, the land grabbing and slavery. It's all embedded in this. How much is racism and the racism conversation, national conversation, how much does that feature in the gun conversation and the talks that you give? Well,
you're right. The filibuster, many of these systems were set up to maintain the status quo in times when the status quo was pretty damned undemocratic in the United States. Lots of, come on. Women didn't vote then. Black people certainly didn't vote. They were still owned by white people. So that's when all of these laws were established. And certainly the filibuster and some of our electoral college issues among those. Do I think that racism plays a large role in gun politics? Yeah, not exactly hearkening back to that, but I can tell you that this became a major issue in modern U.S. politics as soon as America's first black president started to lead in the polls in 2007. I saw it personally with my own eyes. Prior to 2007, when Barack Obama again became the leading candidate for president, the United States had never purchased more than 7.5 million guns in a single year ever in the history of the nation. By the time Barack Obama left office, the nation was purchasing over 16 million guns a year, more than doubled, more than 100% increase. Every single executive that I knew in the shooting sports industry referred to Barack Obama not as president or not as Barack or not as Obama. They called him the best gun salesman in America. That was his official gun industry moniker. And so on one hand, he was vilified. He was taking the country apart. And I dealt with racial invective, especially from the dealer and consumer level all the time, like almost every day. Conspiracy stuff that now makes, to me is at the root of QAnon. But it was always laced with racial invective. And I just don't think you can get away from the central way in which race plays a role in this. The last thing I'll say is the highest gun sales year ever wasn't the last year of Barack Obama's reign of his term. It was during the Black Lives Matter protest and counter-protest and COVID of 2020. During that year, almost 23 million guns were bought and sold, and almost 4 million of those were AR-15s. So race and the fears and the conspiracies that come from it really do play a central role in this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ryan Busse. Appreciate your expertise and your ongoing activism and campaign. And we'll keep an eye on that and support you where we can. Don't forget to subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5 Minute News Daily podcast, which drops every morning. And leave an iTunes review if you can. I'm Anthony Davis. Join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.